Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mad in America Radio. My name is Brooke Seam, and I am the author of May Cause Side Effects. Today, I'm with Jules Hotz, a solutions-focused journalist based in New York City, who is also the author of the forthcoming book, The Connection Cure. Her stories have appeared in the New York Times, Wired, Scientific American, the Boston Globe, Time, and more. After studying sociology at the University of Cambridge, she joined the Solutions Journalism Network, where she helps other journalists rigorously report on what's working to solve today's biggest problems. Before becoming a journalist, Julia worked as a teacher, bartender, pizza server, and summer camp forest ranger. She enjoys hiking up mountains, riling up dance floors, running around parks, biking around New York, and budget traveling around the world, as well as building the longest road around Catan. Julia, welcome to the Mad in America podcast.
Thank you so much, Brooke. I'm such a fan of you. It's such an honor to be here.
Oh, good. So I'm going to start with maybe an unconventional question. How old are you?
That is a great question. Not unconventional. We should normalize asking this. I am 31 years old.
Great. And you have a book, The Connection Cure, that is coming out soon in June. And the reason why I asked you how old you were is because I'm 38. And before I had gone and done some research on you, I had read your book. And I had this idea of you being someone a good 20 years older than you are, in part because of your excellent writing and your journalism. And also just because the book, The Connection Cure, the subtitle is The Prescriptive Power of Movement, Nature, Art, Service, and Belonging. And in reading the book, there was a part of me that kind of said, I can't believe that we have to have a book about this because it seems so obvious. And then when I started doing the research on you, I realized that you're quite young and you were kind of coming of age right at that time when social media and the more technologically connected world has really blown up. And so I started to think to myself, there is a whole generation of people who don't remember what it was like before the internet effectively. And what seems obvious to some of us might not be obvious to them. And so let's start there. Let me know, like, how did you grow up? What was the connection that you explore in your book? What was that like for you as a child? And how has that influenced your book now?
That's a great question. And thank you for the compliment. It's rare to be, take being called older as a compliment, but I totally get where you're coming from. It's so true. I think people like you and me, people in our 30s, my brother is 34, we're sort of on the cusp, right? Of having witnessed, the beginning of a more internet-based, phone-based childhood and a play-based childhood. And I was very fortunate to be in the camp of a play-based childhood. I grew up in New Jersey, playing in the backyard, hours on end with my brother. Yes, we had AOL Instant Messenger in middle school, but it really wasn't a dominating and central force in my life. Facebook too, sure. But I think that I was able to benefit from in-person connection. And that was a privilege, right? I mean, having a childhood where I felt safe, I felt, secure in my home. And that I was able to just play outside and doodle and move around and go look at frogs, I did get to see that. That being said, as I got older, I got a smartphone when I went to college when I was 18. And I did witness, that sort of play-based connection. Even in your 20s, you're still playing, becoming a bit more rare. And I do think you're so right that some of this stuff, the health creating value of time in nature, of moving your body, of creating art, of serving some greater cause, of spending time in person with a group that you really feel you can belong to, it's so obvious and intuitive that it's hard to believe we need a book about it. But I think for what you're alluding to there, the fact that kids today and adults are spending more time on their phones, more disconnected from these sources, is driving a force that's saying these things are so important and we need to figure out a way to prescribe them just as we prescribe any other medication.
Yeah, I agree. I was reading the book and I can't say I've been socially thriving the past year or so. I've definitely felt a lot of the loneliness and the disconnection. And again, it seems obvious to me. And at the same time, I'm disconnected. And so in reading this, it was certainly getting my brain to turn a little bit to figure out how I can bring more meaningful connections into my own world. So let's talk about what exactly a social prescription is. And as you describe that to us, can you also give us an idea of what a social determinant is?
Absolutely. And just to pull that thread together, I think it's so important you say that. I've certainly felt the same way. And I think COVID was a certainly really strong force in helping us all get a taste of that disconnection. And I think in some ways, because we were sort of forced to spend time inside, because screens and social media was our primary way of connection, a lot of us haven't recovered from that. And loneliness, when we hear it, we think of the sort of caricature of loneliness, Ebenezer Scrooge, an older person alone in their house. But I think in the past couple of years, we sort of have this epidemic of loneliness. And that leads into your question about what is a social determinant of health? This is kind of a wonky phrase, not my favorite, that suggests that most of our health is determined by factors in our environment. And when we hear environment, we think like, oh, okay, trees. Do you have trees? Yes, that's part of it. But it's also, do you have access to food? Do you have safe and reliable transportation? It's these very basic resources. And it's also these sort of psychological resources. Do you have a community of friends with whom you can belong? Do you have a job or something that gives you a sense of purpose? All of these things that happen in our environment affect our health. Some studies suggest that 80% of our health differences are driven by these social determinants. So what social prescriptions aim to do is to address those social determinants. These are not, and let me say this loud and clear for all the introverts among us, these are not, I'm going to go force you to make friends. These are patient and doctor driven prescriptions. We could talk about what that means for activities and resources in your community that address your social determinants. They can be with 2 people, they can be with 20 people, they can be with 0 people, actually. Sometimes it's just as simple as a prescription for, fresh fruit and veggies, a prescription for housing assistance. For some of the more psychological social determinants, though, right? Like, do you have people with whom you belong? Do you have a sense of purpose? It can also look like things such as art classes or nature clubs, cycling groups, volunteer causes, farms. I mean, the list is kind of endless and it kind of depends on, what is available in the community of both the patient and the healthcare provider.
When you say a social prescription, are you talking a literal prescription? Like, does it get written down on a script and can you effectively turn that in to some organization and get a service or a thing in return?
Absolutely. I mean, it depends sort of on how the health provider and the patient determine this. Some of them are a little bit more ad hoc, but in many cases, I've seen the physical prescription pad. I'll never forget, this doctor in the Netherlands was showing me, she has like a checklist. It looks like just like her RX pad for anything else that has, in Dutch, of course, service, motherhood support, art, nature. And there are also electronic portals that are facilitating this. There's a group in the United States called Unite Us that's facilitating these literal social prescriptions digitally. in the patient's, electronic medical record. So yes, in many cases, it's a literal prescription. But even when it's not, it's different than just saying, oh, go outside, oh, you should try getting a hobby, right? It's having the specific material support, financial, social, accountability to actually go and take that social prescription the same way you would take any other kind of pill prescription.
Let's go back a little bit because you traveled all around the world to research this book. Why did you want to write this book? How did it come about? It's such an unbelievable opportunity you've had to experience this. What led to the creation of the Connection Cure?
I think there's sort of two answers. I'm a journalist, and the sort of professional buttoned up answer is probably similar to Robert Whitaker. It was this mystery of why in a healthcare system that is continually expanding, we have more medications now than we've ever had. Why are people still feeling so sick? Why is the number of mental illness going up, going up? And why, even beyond diagnosable mental illness, are we hearing reports of increasing loneliness, stress, languishing? I mean, there's a million different terms to describe how people are just generally not feeling well. And I do this kind of reporting called solutions journalism, which looks at how different communities around the world are responding to these problems. And I found that this thing called social prescribing was a solution. Increasingly, I mean, when I started out, it began in the UK. Today, it's happening in about 30 countries around the world, of addressing those socially determined symptoms of unwellness with social prescriptions.
How did you find the first instance of a social prescription? Where did this word even come up? How did you know that this was the thread you wanted to follow?
This sort of gets into the personal. Why did I, Julia Hotz, this 31-year-old, want to write this book? I think it's because I was really interested in this concept of loneliness. Like, what actually is loneliness? I have this very cultural picture of what that is that looks a lot like an older person being isolated. But I think in myself, in my loved ones, especially in the pandemic, we were understanding loneliness to be this qualitative sort of disconnection, right? Even though you might have friends, even though you might have connections, even though you might be living in a city abundant with people and opportunities, you might not be benefiting from those deep, rich connections every day. So what's working to address that? So I found the first instance of social prescribing when I was a grad student and had done this like qualitative exploration of what actually is loneliness and what's working to address it. In 2018, which was the year that the UK established a Minister of Loneliness. And I was really curious about that. What is a Minister of Loneliness going to do? So I did an experiment where I surveyed people in my community. I was at University of Cambridge at the time, asking, are you lonely? There's a clinical scale for loneliness. And people who met that sort of clinical threshold of being lonely, which is lacking companionship, feeling isolated, feeling left out. People who met that threshold, I was curious about what does that look like in your day-to-day life and what has worked? What do you think this minister should do? And it was through them that they had heard about social prescribing, which back in 2018 was very, very hush-hush, not a buzzword. A couple of innovative healthcare providers were doing this. So I basically kind of became obsessed with that story. And during the pandemic, where I thought as a journalist, we have a news peg here, more and more people are lonely, sort of by circumstance, I did a big investigation into social prescribing for Wired UK. And I looked at two practices that were treating their patients' type 2 diabetes and loneliness, and then chronic pain and loneliness with social prescriptions. One was for a cycling group, one was for a volunteer gig. That was in 2021. And then in the year after that, I mean, the concept just really exploded. More and more countries around the world were looking for blueprints. The UK itself that year really invested systemically in social prescribing to expand it. And now, hard to believe for Americans like you and me, it's coming here. And it just felt like this was a story that hadn't really been told. In some ways had been told because, right, we know that nature is good for us, art is good for us, but we hadn't really heard about what is healthcare doing to make those benefits more accessible to their patients.
There are effectively 5 major pillars of social prescribing. Can you explain what the 5 pillars are and how they're helping?
Yeah, and I should note that the 5 pillars I focused on in the book are really about the psychosocial determinants of health. Social prescriptions, like I said, also apply to food, money, housing support, legal support, because those things affect our health too, right? Somebody who can't afford their rent, can't get, healthy food, they're not going to be interested in hearing about a cycling prescription. But I focus on those 5 because those seem to be the 5 that kept coming up, whether I was in the UK or Portugal or South Korea or the United States. And those are movement, which works really well for lifestyle diseases and depression. Nature is another one. And there's a certain quality of nature that we can talk about that makes it really effective for treating disorders of attention, like ADHD, addiction, stress, even. The third is art, which I'm excited to talk to you about. I've been following your own art journey. Art is really effective for treating symptoms of anxiety, helping people reframe trauma. The fourth is service, which is effective for chronic pain, dementia, any sort of physical ailment that keeps people in their bodies and in their heads. Service, volunteering can help take us out. And then the fifth, and maybe the most obvious with a title like Connection Cure, is belonging, right? This feeling of belonging to a group, to a cause. That is what's really an antidote for loneliness.
One of the things I thought was pretty interesting about the book is that and even in the way you describe it now, is that there seemed to be a pretty clear line between the problem you're having and the social prescription that would be appropriate for that. And so often I feel like we're bombarded with all the things we have to do. We have to exercise. We have to get in nature. We have to volunteer. We have to make sure everyone's okay in our life. And it can feel really overwhelming. So in your experience, is that sort of true? Can we simplify it? If we can go all in on nature for a while, is that something that seems to be helping? Is it a pretty clear cut?
I think 2 things are true. The tagline of social prescribing is to replace the question of what's the matter with you? What are your symptoms? What can I diagnose you with? What is your identity around that diagnosis? We're shifting from that to what matters to you. And that might seem like a lofty question, but it looks like things like, how would you spend your spare time? What sort of things make you light up? What did you love as a child that you haven't been able to return to since? Social prescriptions are driven by what matters to a patient, which is to say, even if somebody is struggling with depression, for instance, which I just said, movement-based activities are really effective for that. If that person is like, I really love art, I miss creating art, that is also effective, right? So it's a little bit of mixing the science with the patient choice. And I think that is the bottom line with social prescribing, what we want this to do. We want this to be another option on the healthcare menu. We don't even want this to replace the existing options on the healthcare menu if they're working for a person. And an example I could give around that with depression specifically is the story of this woman, Amanda. Amanda, when I meet her, she is this bright, blue-eyed, spirited, almost has this like childlike exuberance about her. I'm an American, so I have like 4 bags with me. She offers to help them right away. She's very engaged with her environment. And yet 4 years ago, she had 5, she calls it her big 5 really terrible things happened to her. One, and unfortunately, I know you can relate to this, her mother died. She had a parent die that she was very close with. 2, she found out her husband was cheating on her, so she got a divorce. 3, she lost her job during the pandemic. 4, because of all 3 of those things, she had to move to a brand new place where she didn't know anyone. And 5th was the pandemic itself. Imagine having those 3 things happening to you, moving to a brand new place where you literally don't know anybody. So Amanda, this exuberant person, understandably is having reactions to this change in her environment. And she finds herself ruminating, unable to get out of bed, having these really deep, dark thoughts. She goes to the doctor. She gets diagnosed with major depressive disorder and is put on the highest possible dose of antidepressants. And Amanda's case was severe. I mean, she had told me that she had suicidal ideation. Understandable that this would happen. But then something else happens to Amanda. She starts talking to her sister and she starts reading up on this program in her new town in the south of England, southwest England, where they were doing a clinical trial for people with severe depression and how a sea swimming course could help them. And this is supported by some literature showing that, one, moving your body, exercise, releases serotonin and has some of the same effects, comparable effects to what SSRIs do, as well as the physiological benefits of being in cold water. I should note that these are like cold, open water sea swims, not like, a hot day at the beach. They're doing this hardcore in the wintertime. And the third is that she would through this group, she would be meeting other people who were doing this hobby together. They weren't, the focus wasn't on their depression. It was on how they were all interested in wanting to try this thing. So Amanda talks to her mental health nurse. Her mental health nurse prescribes her a spot in this course. And what happens to Amanda, who, had mentioned that she loved swimming as a child, but was kind of afraid, like going out and swimming in the ocean is not just like an accessible or easy thing. What happens to her is she said she started to feel like herself again. She describes it as having a reason to wake up in the morning. She bonds with these other, mostly older women like herself. Amanda's about in her 50s in this group. So she's making friends. And through those friends, through this shared connection, again, about this hobby, not about depression, they're also doing other things together, like planning tea meetups and jam exchanges, very British thing, on the weekend. In other words, Amanda's social prescription is reconnecting her to the things that once mattered to her. And her story is that, and now, this course ended, but Amanda still meets up with this group every weekend. She's still on antidepressants, but she describes it as almost like a little chemical boost keeping her wheels on, which is to say specifically, she's gone from the absolute maximum dose to the absolute minimum dose. And I think more important even than, her actual prescription is the relationship she had to this disorder. She understood that it wasn't just this medication that could help her. She understood that there were other things that could help her too in conjunction with that. And that this diagnosis that felt like it ruled her life was now just a part of her life.
Let's talk a little bit more about antidepressants and prescription psychiatric drugs. You don't really go too much into the book, but I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this. And so many people in my work, when they reach out to me, in my experience on antidepressants for so many years, was that it numbed my ability to understand what matters to me. So I think a big question that's going to come up is that, okay, everything in this book is great, but what if you've been medicated for so long that you were so disconnected from yourself that this seems like nice sounding things that don't apply. Did you run into anything in your research about how people can bridge that gap?
A couple of things to say to that. First of all, you're absolutely right. I don't go so much in deep to the side effects of antidepressants for a couple of reasons. One is that I think your book and Whitaker's book are so important in telling that story that's been missing, I think, from the narrative on depression. And this book is meant to show, I think people walk away maybe from reading your book and Whitaker's book feeling so seen, so heard. Finally, someone has understood my story. And now what? And now what do I do? And I think part of the exciting new idea here is that doctors are now and therapists are now prescribing, social connections the same way they would with antidepressants. That said, you're absolutely right. I mean, first of all, the question, what matters to you, that's a little bit lofty. I think that in an ideal relationship between a doctor, a therapist, or this third position called a link worker, who's kind of the bridge between, we can talk about that, but the health worker and the community organization that has time to really get to know the patient and who also knows their community really well, they can sort of ask the right questions to dig that up. So Amanda's a unique case. Amanda was pretty proactive. And you're right that I think I talk in the book about something called the depression catch-22, which is that people who are struggling with these symptoms one symptom is exhaustion, lethargy, loss of interest in the things you used to love. And even though the science says, move your body, do something you love, the very physical symptoms of that can make it so hard. I think that's very real. And I think that social prescribing is about making that a little bit easier with time. Not saying that, in that first appointment, that doctor or health worker or link worker is going to have downloaded your full story and know exactly what to prescribe you based on that. I think it comes from a series of conversations, much like therapists do, of getting to know the person, but importantly, not so much getting to know the details of their symptoms so much or everything that went wrong in their life, but what went right in their life? When was the last time you felt like something really excited you? What did you used to love as a child? What could you spend hours doing and just get so lost in that? And you're right. I think that culturally, it might take us some time to get to those questions because we don't ask them so much, and certainly not in a healthcare setting. But I think it's a situation of building the plane as we fly it, where health workers are realizing, okay, there are questions we can get to that sort of unlock this part of the patient that's otherwise invisible in healthcare. That's exactly that phrase, unlock. That is what a lot of the patients who've been given social prescriptions have said to me. They said, I'm always feeling like I'm a depression story. I'm an anxiety story. I'm seen as broken. I'm seen as something to be fixed. But when I went to this different doctor or therapist or link worker, and then when I went to this social prescription, I was seen for a part of me that feels more like me, this part of me that is bringing out what matters to me. So yes, I think it takes time to get there. We can't gloss over that challenge. But I think that additional time and investment in figuring out the right questions to ask can be life-changing for the person who is in that appointment and on the other side of that.
It's so fascinating because what I'm seeing, what's happening right now in the world of mental health, if you will, in the cultural temperature, is that much like the K recovery, the K economical recovery that seems to be happening post-COVID, where people are going one of two directions, I'm really seeing that in the world of mental health as well, where at the same time that this seems to be this unbelievable spotlight on diagnoses and prescription medications and talking about feelings all the time and trying to get everybody into therapy, that doesn't necessarily seem like it's working. the antidote for this, and I'm seeing this in your work, I'm seeing this in, Jonathan Haidt's work, I'm seeing it in Abigail Schreier's work, is let's take the spotlight off of the suffering. And that seems to be the paradoxical way out of this mess, is let's not shine a spotlight on our problems all the time. And the connection cure and these 5 pillars, to me, seem to really feed into that.
You're so spot on. And in fact, earlier this week, I don't know if you've seen this article from the New York Times, highlighting the work of Dr. Lucy Fawkes at University of Oxford. But she wrote this really landmark paper about something called the prevalence inflation hypothesis. I briefly mentioned this in the book, but in part because it was so new, I didn't go into it. But it's this idea that constantly talking about our mental illness, our suffering, particularly on social media, it actually is not so good. It feels controversial to say that out loud because on the one hand, we don't want to contribute to a stigma, right, of people talking about their suffering, which is very real. And I think, look, we look back 20, 30 years ago, when it was, or even longer than that, I suppose, when it was just like, no, suck it up, get over it, you'll be fine. Like, that's certainly not the alternative either. I think if there's a third way of honoring that, of course, that suffering is so real. And because it is so real, we also have to get real about like what is working to address that suffering. And in order to do that, I think people who are dealing with those symptoms need to understand that this is a part of them. They're not broken. They're symptoms. I talk in the book about the earliest conceptions of mental illness in the DSM. They were described as reaction types to an environment. And I think it's really fascinating that has sort of been written out of the DSM as it has expanded.
Can you imagine how different our world would be if we had kept reaction instead of diagnosis? You're having a depression reaction to losing your dad when you were 15. Wildly different than you have major depressive disorder.
Absolutely. And I think you're so right. Like, I remember being 8 and watching the commercial for Zoloft, like the little sad blob that floats between A and B. That was the first time I heard about what depression disorder was through the marketing, which, by the way, is that direct marketing is only legal in the United States and New Zealand. That is how I learned about what depression was. And I think, yes, that if we reframed these as reactions, which again are so real, and you would know, you talk very beautifully and eloquently about how your father's death impacted you. And I think sometimes when we want to validate the symptoms, we want to validate that suffering, we confuse that with rooting an identity and almost like a life sentence in that suffering, right? I mean, you tell me, is that how would you have changed if reaction type had been how you understood your symptoms when you were 15?
I think about that every day because, especially being given a diagnosis at 15, you're so impressionable. And I would kill for a crystal ball where I could see what would have happened if I hadn't, gone through what I have gone through. And I just can't believe at the scale that we're seeing this now with kids. Maybe we're just all different and there's a light and a dark side to everything. I mean, being scatterbrained and not being able to focus on one thing for 8 hours isn't necessarily abnormal. And on top of that, it has some huge positives and benefits.
There is some beautiful adaptive value in some of these reactions, right? And I talk a little bit about that in the book. Like, a lot of these symptoms, the magnitude at which we're seeing them, is a response to us living in a way we were not meant to live. And I think, and I want to be really clear and say, no, it's obviously when you're dealing with the throes of the deepest, darkest depression, anxiety, ADHD, whatever it might be, it doesn't feel like an adaptation. I do think the point remains, though, that understanding how our environments play a role in the extent to which we feel symptoms is huge. And it's not a new idea. I mean, indigenous communities, experts have been saying this for years. I think what's new is that we have now a system, a healthcare system that, has support from the people who need to support it. Not enough, but we're getting there. That can deliver this. Just as your environment is exacerbating the pain of your symptoms, it can deliver you relief from those symptoms in the same way.
Yeah, even 150 years ago, most people were farmers, right? And we were outside. We were growing our own food in order to then share with our community. We were moving our body as part of our day-to-day life. We, at the end of the day, didn't have a cell phone or television, so people would sit and play music and tell stories and read. I mean, these 5 pillars were built into everyday life. And you talk about the Industrial Revolution a little bit and how that has actually, impacted our lack of connection. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, because I was looking at the Industrial Revolution the way you were talking about it, and then making comparisons to the increased amount of leisure time we have because of AI. And again, we're seeing these disconnections, and it's like we are creating so much time for ourselves to sit around and focus on how we don't feel well, while also directly supporting and buying and wanting the things that are taking away our sense of purpose, much in the way the Industrial Revolution did.
It kind of blew my mind when I had like a permanent jaw drop situation, the same way I felt when I was reading Mad in America of like, wow, okay, the Industrial Revolution is when all of the shit hit the fan. Like, to give one example, let's go back to movement because that's been a theme. When the Industrial Revolution arrived, there was a lot of excitement that, wow, the things that humans used to spend their precious waking hours laboring over, now machines are going to do a lot of that work and we're going to have a lot of time. And at first, this genuinely was awesome. You had the proliferation of public spaces, community groups, public sports, the YMCA. People were really excited to use this newfound, as you say, leisure time in ways that meet their leisure needs and that are done in community and together. And then something shitty happens, which tends to happen a lot. Someone realized, wait a minute, we can make a profit off this. These public spaces where people are playing and enjoying each other's company, well, we can charge a membership fee. These sports that are fun and, joyful and bring you to people, we can make it so that the equipment and the uniforms are really expensive. And, the same is true for the kinds of jobs that we do. I talk about how at one point, your last name was very much tied to the work you did in the community. Bakers, tailors, smiths. Then with the Industrial Revolution, and I think even more now, there's a great book that came out by the late anthropologist David Graeber. We see the rise of these bullshit jobs where people, to your point, are not really understanding their sense of purpose in the workplace. And then outside the workplace, they're disconnected from things that used to give them a sense of purpose. So yeah, no wonder huge swathes of people are not feeling well. Like we were not meant to live like this.
So you mentioned towards the end of the book that social prescription is actually taught in most medical schools in the UK. How in the world do we get that into the US?
For people who like triumph of the underdog stories, that's an awesome story about these medical students who really resonated with social prescribing. And a couple of badass pioneering doctors did too. They tried to get the UK schools to officially teach it and accredit it. The schools were like, no, I don't think so. So they just started doing it anyway. They started, sharing their notes, creating a network. And then by, a couple of years in, this network was so strong. Finally, the, folks in charge of the UK medical school curriculum were kind of like, damn, okay, I guess they've done it anyway. We might as well make it official. In the US, believe it or not, there is a similar movement happening. Oh, and it has to do with, I think, that template sharing across countries. I mentioned that social prescribing is now happening in 30 different countries. Looks very different where you go. And of course, the US is up against its own unique challenges, which we can talk about.
Yeah, let's talk about the practicalities of insurance.
Totally. Yeah. Let's talk about that. And I'll just quickly say that at places like Harvard and Columbia, there are official social prescribing student collectives that are basically trying to do what the UK did just a little bit later. Now, the second question you bring up, which everybody brings up, is like, how are insurance companies going to get on board with this? As we know, and as Mad in America has made clear, there's a really clear incentive for insurance companies to prescribe pills. It's easy, boom, diagnosis code, boom, we cover this. Therapy, sounds like it's going to take a long time, not so much. My mom's a psychotherapist, so she is particularly vocal about that. And social prescriptions, I mean, what would they do there? So here's what I'd say. You'll notice how some insurance companies have started to do things like sponsor gym memberships. For my mom and dad, for example, they're 70 and they're at the age where, things stop working as they do and they actually become very expensive for these insurance companies to cover. So again, not necessarily operated by the goodness of their heart, but out of incentives, they figure, okay, if we invest in this gym membership and being active is associated with, reduced cardiovascular risk, I mean, all of the major burdens of disease in the United States, a lot of that reduced with more physical activity. Insurance companies figure that this is a smart preventative investment. Not all of them, but they're coming around to that logic based on the economics. So I think, and I don't just think, I know this is true, that more insurance companies are using that same logic that this is an investment in preventative health to cover things like art prescriptions. This is actually happening in New Jersey through a really innovative partnership between Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield, the New Jersey NJPAC Performing Arts Center, where people who are at risk of being costly for the insurance company, people like my parents who are older, they are eligible through this investment to receive social prescriptions, art prescriptions, through the offerings at NJPAC. And this pilot is still underway. But if we know anything about how this has worked in other countries, which is what my book gets into, we know that this is actually a very sound investment from the economic standpoint. If people are preventing these costly health problems, if they're not ending up in the emergency room, which, by the way, a lot of people can't even afford to be there, especially if you're uninsured or underinsured, this is a healthcare win, actually. And sounds wild to say that out loud, to think that this could be mainstream in the United States. But I think whenever there's something new, this is how it happens. A state tries it, they get good results, they share it with another state. We're seeing this with Medicaid, for example. Like Medicaid is now being used to cover food, rent in some states. But it takes time. I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say like this is going to happen overnight. But I do think there's a future in which insurance companies would be covering more of these social prescriptions based on that logic.
Where do you think between prescribers, patients, and in the insurance companies and maybe government, who's going to have the biggest pull to get this into the mainstream?
Such a great question. I think about that all the time. I think, and having read, Mad in America and having thoughts about like big pharma, I had thought as a journalist, like no way in hell this is going to work in the United States where there's such a clear incentive for prescribing pills. And then I pulled the curtain back a lot and I said, you know what? Actually, it's not just big pharma. As convenient as it would be to believe that there's just like some man in the sky who's kind of directing all of healthcare, I think it's a lot of forces, and some of them come down to us as patients. I think the change is going to come from patients saying, I want more and other options. I think it's definitely going to come from health workers being trained in how to do this. I think it's going to come from more support from insurance companies and governments investing both in the practicalities of like covering this through an insurance plan, but also positions like link workers, which would kind of serve as that liaison between the patient and the health worker. Because let's be honest, doctors and therapists in America right now have their hands totally full. And the thought of being like, here's another thing you have to add to the menu seems really impossible. And I think it is kind of this third thing, perhaps most importantly, in the culture. And I think we've sort of alluded to the fact that those conversations are happening. There is a bigger discussion happening about what would the world look like if we moved from a deficit-based model of defining ourselves through our illnesses and our symptoms to an asset-based model. People do resonate with this. You know, you talk to people who've been through this, and sure, for some of them, healthcare's usual rigmarole, I diagnose you, I treat you, I prescribe you a pill, that works. But for a lot of them, it doesn't. And I think the change is going to come when we can marry that frustration with a practical solution that's been effective in other countries.
What can someone do who doesn't have someone in the US specifically, since it's our primary audience here? What can someone do who doesn't have access to a doctor who does social prescriptions or doesn't know about it? What lessons can they take from your work, and how can they apply it to their own lives in order to get the benefit if perhaps the formal programs aren't in place yet?
Great question. And that was true for me. You know, part 3 of my book is me trying to prescribe myself these things without a doctor, kind of cutting out the middleman, which I should say, by the way, is like the end goal of social prescribing. You know, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to do this through healthcare. In an ideal world, these things would be made more accessible, more culturally in the ether, that social prescribing is something we can access just like pill prescribing. So on a practical level, in this book, you know, you'll read about these patients who've been through the formal social prescribing system. What I do in the back of the book, there's an appendix that says, this is how this patient felt. Let's take Amanda again. Amanda felt like these deep, dark pains, lethargic, didn't know what was, you know, didn't have a reason to wake up in the morning. And then I compare that to some of the pains that I've felt, much more mild, sad, ruminating on a breakup, on grief. I think about how movement helped her, literally. The science says that. And then the experience of going through a group, which held her accountable to move. What she found on the other side of that, and the appendix has that too. It's almost like a more complete DSM saying, here's the reaction you've had to this painful environment, and here's the reaction you can have to an environment that fulfills this crucial need. And so for Amanda, you know, that looked like, she said her life became bright again. I know that you and others have sort of talked about this like dulling and numbing that happens when you experience depression. Amanda describes as her life became bright again. She had a reason to wake up in the morning. For me, when I prescribed myself this movement group in my community, I felt a version of that. I felt like euphoric and giddy, and almost like once I expended that energy, I had more energy. And so for the very practical question of like, okay, what was that movement group you did? We are building with Social Prescribing USA a database of how people can access groups in their community. You have your zip code, you have your ingredient, movement, nature, art, service, belonging, and boom, you have options for like what this looks like. So a lot of the group that I did, it was a group called Back on My Feet. It is a running and walking group that runs with people transitioning out of homelessness every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Had a lot of similarities to Amanda's group in that it was early morning with people kind of out of your comfort zone. There are chapters for that all around the country. And a lot of the social prescriptions that I try, that's true for. So stay tuned, because that resource, which free, is coming to listeners of this podcast.
Oh, that's so exciting. Great. Awesome. Can you tell us where we can find you on the internet, how people can get in touch with you?
Absolutely. You can find my work, The Connection Cure, orderable at Simon & Schuster, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and most importantly, your local bookstore. You can find me on all the socials, although I do use them pretty sparingly. Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, LinkedIn. My handle is Hotz Thoughts. And the website that we're building is www.socialprescribing.co. And that aims to be this big resource hub of where both people who want a social prescription and providers who want to start social prescribing can find resources to help them.
I'm so glad you're building something truly actionable that people can use and incorporate into their life right away. That's going to be huge. Congratulations.
Thank you. And I should say I'm just kind of like the hub. I mean, other people have spent years of their life building this. I especially want to highlight the work of Social Prescribing USA. They have a mission to make social prescribing available to every American by 2035. They're a group of volunteers who are just working hard to listen to these stories and actually get resources to people. So it's through them and with them that we, the collective we, are building these resources.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us, Jules, and for sharing your book.
Thank you so much, Brooke. That was great. It was so great to finally meet you.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.